Yesterday, I did something that no African leader has done in decades. I picked up the phone and told the most powerful man in the world exactly what I thought about his plan to destroy my people's future. That man was Donald Trump, and what I told him is about to change everything you think you know about how small nations deal with superpowers. But let me tell you something that will shock you even more. By the end of our conversation, Trump asked me a question that revealed just how little Washington understands about the continent they've been exploiting for centuries. And my answer? It made him go completely silent for 47 seconds. I counted. During those 47 seconds, I could hear his advisors whispering in the background, scrambling to figure out how a 35-year-old African president had just backed the leader of the free world into a corner. Before I tell you what happened on that explosive call, because trust me, it was more intense than anything you've seen in a Hollywood political thriller, you need to understand what was really at stake. This wasn't just about trade. This wasn't just about economics. This was about whether 22 million people would eat tomorrow, or whether they'd become refugees fleeing a continent that the world has already written off. My name is Leader Traoré. I'm 35 years old. I run Burkina Faso, and yesterday I declared war on the system that's been bleeding Africa dry for centuries. But here's what the intelligence agencies in Washington don't know about me. Before I became president, I spent 3 years studying American economic policy at night while commanding military operations during the day. I know their playbook better than they think. I've read every trade agreement they've ever signed. I've analyzed every aid package they've ever delivered. And I've discovered something that would make every American taxpayer furious if they knew the truth. Stay with me, because what I'm about to tell you will explain why every intelligence agency in Washington is now watching my every move, why the French embassy in Ouagadougou has tripled its security detail, and why Chinese diplomats have suddenly become very interested in our mining contracts. 3 days ago, my economic advisors rushed into my office at 2:30 in the morning with news that made my blood run cold. The United States was about to impose a 30% tariff on everything we export to America. Not 5%, not 10%, but 30%. To put that in perspective, that's not a trade adjustment, that's economic execution. But here's what really got to me. Here's what made me pick up that phone and do something that could either save my country or get me killed. They didn't even have the courtesy to warn us first. We found out the same way everyone else did, through rumors, through leaked documents, through the whispers of diplomats who couldn't look us in the eye. As if 22 million people weren't worth a phone call before you destroy their economy. But there was something else in those leaked documents that made me realize this wasn't just about Burkina Faso. This was part of a coordinated strategy to reshape Africa's relationship with the global economy, and we were just the test case. That's when I knew this wasn't about trade policy. This was about sending a message that Africa should know its place, that we should be grateful for whatever scraps fall from their table, that we should never, ever forget who's really in charge. They were wrong, dead wrong, and I was about to prove it to them in a way that would echo through diplomatic circles for decades. Let me tell you something about the phone call that's got Washington talking, that's made European diplomats nervous, and that's caused stock markets in 3 continents to fluctuate. Because what happened in those 29 minutes wasn't diplomacy. It was a reckoning. When Trump's voice came through that secure line, I could hear it immediately. The tone you use when you're talking to someone you don't consider an equal. The casual dismissal. The assumption that I'd called to beg, maybe to offer some concessions in exchange for mercy. He started talking about America's economic interests, about protecting American jobs, about how these tariffs were necessary for America's future. He used words like inevitable and unfortunate, as if the destruction of African economies was just the cost of doing business. I let him finish his entire prepared speech. I could hear his advisors coaching him through his earpiece, feeding him statistics about American manufacturing and unemployment rates. Then I said something that I guarantee no American president has heard from an African leader in decades. I said, "Mr. President, let me tell you about my economic interests." The line went quiet. Not just quiet, but silent in that way that tells you someone has just realized they're not in control of the conversation anymore. That's when I told him exactly what his 30% tariff would do to my people. But here's the part that really got his attention. Here's the part that made him realize he wasn't dealing with the kind of African leader he was used to. I told him about Sarah. Sarah is 23 years old. She works in a textile factory in Ouagadougou, not because she chose to, but because it was the only job available when she graduated from technical school with honors. She supports her mother, her 2 younger brothers, and her own infant daughter. On the wages she makes sewing clothes that get shipped to American stores where they sell for more than she makes in a month. When Trump's tariff hits, Sarah doesn't just lose her job. She loses everything. Her family goes hungry. Her daughter stops getting the medication she needs for a respiratory condition that could be easily treated if they could afford it. Her brothers drop out of school to try to find work that doesn't exist. And Sarah becomes one of the millions of young Africans who start looking north toward Libya, toward the Mediterranean, toward the boats that sometimes make it to Europe and sometimes don't. Sometimes those boats become floating coffins that wash up on European beaches, and European politicians shake their heads and wonder why these people risk everything to leave their home countries. That's what a 30% tariff looks like in human terms. That's what America first means when you're on the wrong side of it. I told Trump all of this, painting the picture in vivid detail, making him see the faces behind his policy decisions. Then I told him something that made him very, very quiet. I said, Mr. President, you can destroy our textile industry today, but when 10 million young Africans start moving toward your allies in Europe because their economies collapsed, don't call me asking why your migration crisis just got 10 times worse. You see, here's what these people never seem to understand. Despite having access to the best intelligence agencies in the world, when you destabilize African economies, you don't just hurt Africans. You create problems that end up on your doorstep whether you want them there or not. The migration crisis tearing Europe apart didn't start in the Mediterranean. It started in countries where young people couldn't find work, couldn't feed their families, couldn't see a future worth staying for. But the real moment, the moment when I knew this call was going to change everything, came when Trump asked me something I wasn't expecting. He said, "What do you want?" Not, "What can we do to help?" Not, "How can we work together?" Just, "What do you want?" As if this was a negotiation between a landlord and a tenant behind on rent. As if my people's survival was something I needed to bargain for, something I needed to earn through good behavior and compliance. That's when I told him something that I don't think any African leader has ever said to an American president. I said, "I don't want anything from you, Mr. President. I want you to stop taking from us." The silence on that line lasted so long I thought the call had dropped. I could hear papers rustling, muffled conversations, the sound of someone frantically typing. Then he asked me to explain what I meant, and his voice had changed. The condescending tone was gone. Now he sounded like someone who was genuinely curious about an answer he hadn't expected. And that's when I told him about the real cost of doing business with America, the mathematics of exploitation that every African economist knows, but no one talks about in polite diplomatic circles. For every dollar of aid America gives Africa, African countries send back $5 in debt payments, resource extraction profits, and unfavorable trade terms. We're not being helped. We're being harvested. The numbers don't lie, but somehow everyone pretends they don't exist. The African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, that everyone talks about like it's some great gift to Africa, is designed to keep us exactly where we are. Suppliers of raw materials, buyers of finished goods, never competitors, never equals, never allowed to climb the value chain that would actually develop our economies. It's a sophisticated system of economic control disguised as partnership. But here's what really shocked him. Here's what made him realize that this wasn't going to be the conversation he was expecting. I told him I'd been studying his trade policies, all of them, not just the ones affecting Africa. I knew about the deals he'd made with China, the concessions he'd given to Europe, the exceptions he'd carved out for countries that had the power to fight back. And I asked him a simple question that cut through all the diplomatic nonsense. Why do you think Africa deserves less respect than China? You want to know how Trump responded to that? He didn't prom. He changed the subject faster than a politician caught in a scandal. He started talking about security cooperation, about counterterrorism, about how America helps keep Africa stable. That's the oldest trick in the diplomatic playbook. When you can't defend your economic policies, start talking about security. When you can't justify exploitation, start talking about protection. That's when I told him something that really got his attention. I said, "Mr. President, you want to talk about security? Let me tell you what real insecurity looks like." See, here's what they don't understand in Washington, despite having military bases across the continent and intelligence operations in every major African city. The biggest security threat to Africa isn't terrorism, it's economic desperation. When young people can't find work, they don't just disappear into thin air. They join whatever organization promises them a future, promises them purpose, promises them the dignity that legitimate employment should provide. Sometimes that's terrorist groups that offer signing bonuses and regular payments to families. Sometimes it's criminal networks that provide structure and income in the absence of legal alternatives. Sometimes it's migration routes that end in tragedy, but at least represent hope for something better. But all of these problems start with the same thing: an economy that can't provide for its people, an economic system designed to extract value rather than create opportunity. So when America imposes tariffs that destroy African jobs, they're not just hurting our economy, they're creating the exact conditions that breed the instability they claim to be fighting. It's like starting fires and then selling fire insurance. I told Trump that if he really wanted to fight terrorism in Africa, if he genuinely cared about regional stability, the best thing he could do would be to give young Africans a reason to stay home. Give them jobs that pay living wages. Give them hope for advancement. Give them a future worth fighting for instead of fighting against. But that requires treating Africa as a partner, not a charity case that should be grateful for whatever crumbs fall from the table. It requires respecting our right to develop our own industries, not just extract our resources for other people's benefit. And it definitely doesn't include imposing tariffs that could push millions of people into poverty while claiming you're protecting American interests. American interests and African interests don't have to be mutually exclusive unless you design the system that way. That's when the conversation took a turn I wasn't expecting. Trump started asking questions, real questions about our economy, about our industries, about what we actually needed to succeed. For the first time in the conversation, he sounded like he was listening instead of just waiting for his turn to talk. He asked about our agricultural capacity, our mineral resources, our manufacturing potential. He sounded like someone who was finally seeing Africa as an opportunity rather than a problem. I told him about the cotton farmers in our central regions. Families who've been growing some of the finest cotton in the world for generations, cotton that's shipped to factories in China and Bangladesh and Vietnam, then sold back to us as finished clothing at prices we can barely afford. We have the raw materials, we have the skilled workers, we have the infrastructure. What we don't have is permission from the global trade system to add value to our own resources. I told him about our gold mines, some of the richest deposits in the world, controlled by foreign companies that take 90% of the profits and leave us with holes in the ground and environmental damage. We could process that gold ourselves, create jewelry and electronics and medical devices, employ thousands of engineers and technicians and designers. But the current system makes it more profitable to ship raw gold overseas and import finished products. I told him about our young people, the most educated generation in African history, young people who speak 3 or 4 languages, who graduate from universities with degrees in engineering and computer science and business administration, but who are forced to migrate to Europe or America because there are no opportunities at home. Not because they lack skills or ambition, but because the economic system is designed to prevent them from using those skills in their own countries. And I told him the truth that no one in Washington wants to hear, the truth that makes politicians uncomfortable because it challenges the entire narrative of American generosity and African dependence. Africa doesn't need charity. We need fairness. We need the right to add value to our own resources. We need trade agreements that benefit both sides, not just one. We need to be treated like partners capable of contributing to global prosperity, not like problems to be managed or markets to be exploited. That's when Trump said something that surprised me. He said, "What would a fair deal look like?" I wasn't ready for that question because for so long, African leaders have been told to be grateful for whatever we get, to accept the deals we're offered and not ask for more. We've been conditioned to think that fairness is too much to ask for, that equality is unrealistic, that partnership is impossible. But I've never been that kind of leader, and this was my chance to prove it. I told him that a fair deal would mean eliminating the tariffs that make it impossible for African manufacturers to compete in global markets. It would mean allowing us to process our own resources instead of just exporting them raw like some kind of colonial arrangement that never ended. It would mean trade agreements that actually develop African economies instead of just extracting wealth from them. And it would mean respecting our sovereignty in ways that go beyond just diplomatic recognition. No more aid packages with strings attached that benefit American companies more than African people. No more development programs that create dependency instead of capacity. No more treating us like children who can't be trusted to make our own economic decisions about our own resources and our own future. Trump listened to all of this, and I could hear him taking notes, asking his advisors to write things down. Then he asked me a question that really caught me off guard, a question so blunt it was almost refreshing. He said, "Why should I care about any of this?" Not the most diplomatic question, but I appreciated the honesty. At least he wasn't pretending to care while planning to do nothing. I told him that he should care because the alternative is chaos, and chaos has a way of spreading beyond the borders where it starts. When African economies fail, the problems don't stay in Africa. They spread like ripples from a stone dropped in water. The migration crisis that's tearing Europe apart, causing political upheaval and feeding far-right movements, started with economic collapse in countries that couldn't provide for their people. The terrorist groups that threaten global security recruit from populations that have lost hope in legitimate opportunities. The drug trafficking networks that move narcotics from South America to Europe and North America thrive in places where legal economies have failed, where desperate people will do desperate things for money. The piracy that threatens shipping lanes develops in coastal communities where fishing and trade can no longer support families. All of these problems are connected by invisible threads that lead back to the same source: economic systems that work for some people and destroy others. Trade relationships that create wealth for some countries while creating poverty for others, development models that develop some regions while underdeveloping others. I told Trump that he could choose to be part of the solution, or he could watch the problems get worse while pretending they had nothing to do with American policies. But he couldn't pretend that Africa's problems wouldn't eventually become America's problems, because in a connected world, there's no such thing as isolated poverty or contained instability. That's when the conversation really changed. Trump started talking about possibilities instead of limitations, about what Africa could become if we had fair access to global markets, about the opportunities that American businesses were missing by not treating Africa as a real partner capable of innovation and growth. He even started asking about specific sectors where we could expand cooperation: agriculture, technology, manufacturing, renewable energy. For a few minutes, it almost felt like we were having the conversation that Africa and America should have been having for decades. The conversation about mutual benefit instead of one-sided extraction, about partnership instead of paternalism, about development instead of dependency. But then reality set in, and Trump's voice became more cautious. He told me that changing trade policy isn't simple, that there are interests in Washington that benefit from keeping Africa in its current position, that powerful people make money from the status quo, and they don't give up that money easily. He talked about congressional opposition, about corporate lobbying, about the political costs of challenging established relationships. I told him I understood all of that. I'm not naive about how power works, about how entrenched interests resist change, about how difficult it is to challenge systems that have been profitable for decades. But I also told him something that I hope he remembers every time he makes a decision about Africa. I said, "Mr. President, I'm not asking you to be a hero. I'm not asking you to sacrifice American interests for African interests. I'm asking you to be fair. And if you can't be fair, then don't expect us to keep pretending that unfairness is normal." That's when I made it clear that this wasn't just about Burkina Faso, that this conversation represented something bigger than bilateral trade disputes. This was about a principle that goes far beyond economic policy. I told him that Africa is done being patient. We're done waiting for the world to decide that we deserve respect. We're done accepting that other people get to determine our future while we smile and say thank you for the privilege. The days when African leaders would smile and nod while their people suffered, when we would accept crumbs and call them feast, when we would trade our dignity for the illusion of development, those days are over. At least for me, at least for my country, at least for any leader who understands that true leadership means protecting your people's interests, even when it's uncomfortable for other people. I told him that if America wants to be our partner, we welcome that partnership. We want good relationships with America. We want trade and cooperation and mutual benefit. But if America wants to be our master, if the relationship is based on dominance rather than equality, then we have a fundamental problem that no amount of diplomatic politeness can solve. And I made it very clear that Burkina Faso is prepared to find other partners if necessary. Partners who treat us as equals, partners who respect our right to develop our own economy on our own terms, partners who understand that sustainable relationships are built on mutual benefit rather than one-sided exploitation. The world is bigger than America, and Africa has options that didn't exist 20 years ago. That's when Trump asked me the question that really showed he was starting to understand what this conversation was really about, what was really at stake beyond trade statistics and economic indicators. He said, "What happens if we can't find a solution?" And his voice had changed again. Now he sounded genuinely concerned about the answer. I told him the truth that I think scared him more than any threat could have. If America goes ahead with these tariffs, if this becomes the pattern for how America treats Africa, we'll survive. It won't be easy, and some of our people will suffer, and it will take longer to achieve our development goals, but we'll survive. Africa has survived worse than American economic pressure. We've survived colonialism, we've survived structural adjustment programs, we've survived decades of unfavorable trade relationships. But the relationship between America and Africa will change forever, and that change will echo through generations. Because we'll know that when it mattered, when African people needed fairness, when we asked to be treated as partners rather than subjects, America chose short-term profit over long-term partnership. And that knowledge will shape every decision we make going forward. Every trade agreement we negotiate, every security cooperation we consider, every diplomatic initiative we support. Africa will remember who stood with us when we needed partners and who treated us like disposable assets when it was convenient. And those memories will determine which countries African leaders trust when the next generation of global challenges requires global cooperation. I told Trump that this moment was bigger than trade policy, bigger than economic statistics, bigger than the next election cycle. It was about whether America wants to be remembered as a country that helped Africa rise, or as a country that tried to keep Africa down when we were finally ready to stand up. The choice was his, but he needed to understand that it was a choice with permanent consequences. That's when he said something that gave me hope, the first real hope I'd felt since this crisis began. He said, "Let me look into this. Give me some time to see what's possible." It wasn't a promise. It wasn't a commitment. But it was more than I've gotten from most American leaders in my lifetime. And it was proof that when you speak to power with strength instead of weakness, when you come to the table as an equal instead of a supplicant, sometimes power actually listens. But here's what I want you to understand about this conversation, about what it represents for Africa and for the world. It wasn't really about Trump, and it wasn't really about tariffs. It was about Africa finally saying, enough. Enough of being treated like a junior partner in our own development. Enough of watching our resources leave while our people stay poor. Enough of being told to be grateful for scraps while others feast on our wealth. For too long, African leaders have been afraid to speak truth to power, afraid that if we push too hard, we'll lose what little we have. Afraid that if we demand respect, we'll be cut off from the global economy entirely. Afraid that if we challenge the status quo, we'll be punished in ways that hurt our people more than they hurt us. But fear has never built anything worth having, and respect has never been given to those who won't demand it. I'm not afraid of American power. I respect it, I understand it, I know how to work with it, but I'm not afraid of it, because I know something that I think America sometimes forgets in its moments of arrogance and overreach. Power without legitimacy is just force, and force without consent eventually fails. The British Empire learned this lesson, the Soviet Union learned this lesson, and every empire that has ever existed has learned that you can't build lasting relationships on domination and exploitation. Real power, sustainable power, comes from partnership. It comes from creating systems that work for everyone involved. It comes from understanding that your prosperity and my prosperity are connected, that your security and my security depend on each other, that your future and my future are intertwined whether we like it or not. That's the lesson I tried to teach Trump yesterday. That's the message I hope he takes back to Washington. That's the principle I'll carry into every conversation with every world leader who thinks Africa should be grateful for whatever we're given. The conversation is over, but the real work is just beginning. Because whether Trump acts on what we discussed or not, Africa is changing. We're no longer willing to accept relationships based on inequality. We're no longer willing to smile while we're being exploited. We're no longer willing to wait for permission to develop our own economies and control our own resources. The world is about to discover what happens when Africa stops asking for fairness and starts demanding it, and I promise you, it's going to be more powerful than anything they've ever seen.